My name is Alison, and on a cold night in December 2022, I had a near-death experience where I firmly believe Jesus showed me the dangers of technology in my generation. If you are a parent or have young people in your family, I urge you to listen to this warning. Before that life-changing night, I didn't believe in these kinds of experiences. I would have dismissed them as exaggerated or imaginary. But now, I felt compelled to share my story on this channel to warn as many adults and young people as possible. Please comment below if you believe me, if you agree, or even if you disagree with this vision. Here's what happened. It started as a normal Friday night. I was lying on the couch in our living room scrolling endlessly on my phone, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. I wasn't even looking for anything specific. I was just trapped in an endless cycle of videos, posts and updates. The content didn't seem meaningful, but somehow I couldn't stop. Hours slipped by and I didn't even notice the time passing. My parents had already gone to bed. My brothers and sisters were in their rooms, and I was alone with the glow of my screen lighting up the dark room. Then something strange happened. I started to feel a sudden dizziness, like the entire room was spinning around me. It came out of nowhere, and I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe I had stared at my screen for too long, or perhaps my blood sugar was low because I hadn't eaten much that day. I told myself to get up and drink some water, thinking it would help. But before I could move, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was floating above my body, staring down at myself. There I was, slumped over on the couch with my phone still glowing in my hand. The sight of it was surreal. Panic started to rise within me, followed by confusion. Was I dead? What was happening to me? It was as though I could see everything clearly, yet I couldn't feel connected to my body anymore. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came out. I was silent, trapped in this strange state, watching myself from above. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. That moment was terrifying. I felt powerless, unable to communicate or move, and the scene below me was deeply unsettling. My lifeless body, illuminated only by the glow of the screen, seemed so small and distant. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew something extraordinary was unfolding. That's when a blinding light suddenly filled the room, cutting through the darkness in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't like any light I had experienced on Earth. It was pure, radiant, and all-encompassing. I turned toward the source of the light, and there he was, Jesus. He didn't look like the images I had seen in church or the paintings in Sunday school. He was more radiant, more powerful, and more real than anything I could have imagined. His presence was overwhelming in the best way, not just because of the light he radiated, but because of the profound sense of love and authority that surrounded him. It wasn't a love that was soft or fleeting. It was a love that carried immense strength and purpose. I felt completely exposed in his presence, yet at the same time, I felt comforted and known in a way that I had never experienced before. I wanted to fall to my knees and bow before him, but I couldn't move. It was as if the sheer power of his presence had frozen me in awe. "Come," he said, extending his hand toward me. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, calm, and carried a weight that made it impossible to argue or resist. It wasn't just a voice I heard with my ears. It resonated deep within me, almost as if it was speaking directly to my soul. Without hesitation, I reached out and took his hand. The moment my hand touched his, the entire room disappeared. In an instant, I found myself standing in a vast, endless void. It wasn't completely empty though. As I looked around, I began to notice glowing screens hovering all around us. There were phones, tablets, computers, TVs, and even VR headsets floating in mid-air. At first they seemed like ordinary devices, but as I looked closer, I realized they were anything but ordinary. These screens were alive with something dark and sinister, something I couldn't quite understand but could feel deep in my spirit. On each screen, faces stared back at me, millions of faces blank and emotionless. Their eyes were void of life, as if they were under some kind of spell or hypnotized. It was unsettling and eerie, and the weight of what I was seeing pressed heavily on my heart. These weren't just screens, and the people looking back weren't just using devices. They were connected to them in a way that felt unnatural and oppressive. The sight filled me with unease, a deep sense of knowing that something was terribly wrong, though I couldn't fully grasp it yet. This void was not like any place I had ever been, and these screens were not just tools or gadgets. They were something far more powerful, something that carried an energy I could only describe as sinister. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I could feel the importance of what Jesus was about to show me. Jesus gestured toward the screens. "This is the battlefield," he said, his voice heavy with both sorrow and urgency. "The enemy has chosen this as his primary weapon against your generation, Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. He knows your potential. He knows what you are capable of achieving for my kingdom, so he is working tirelessly to destroy you." I struggled to understand. "But how?" I asked, confused. "It's just technology. It's just entertainment." Jesus turned to look at me, and the sadness in his eyes is something I will never forget. "It started that way," he said softly. "But what you see as harmless is far from it. The enemy uses these screens to enslave hearts, minds, and souls. Technology was created to be a tool, something to help people, but it has become a trap." I looked closer at the screens, and what I saw left me shaken. Chains were extending from the devices, wrapping tightly around people's wrists, necks, and even their hearts. Some were shackled so tightly they could barely move. The weight of the chains seemed unbearable. Each chain had a word etched onto it: comparison, anxiety, lust, distraction, pride, envy. These words burned into my mind as if they were being engraved onto my own heart. "They don't even know they're chained," I whispered, horrified by the scene. "That's the enemy's greatest trick," Jesus replied, his tone filled with deep sorrow. "To enslave them without their knowledge. He makes them believe they are free while he holds their souls captive." As I continued to watch, the screen suddenly turned a bright, ominous red. Flames flickered at the edges of the devices, casting an eerie glow. Then I saw a terrifying symbol begin to appear, glowing on every screen. But it didn't stop there. The same symbol started to manifest on people's foreheads and hands as though it was being burned into their skin. The sight made my heart race, and I felt a deep sense of dread. I looked at Jesus, desperate to understand. This wasn't just about devices or entertainment. It was something far more dangerous, something designed to lead people further from him and closer to destruction. The weight of what I was seeing was overwhelming, and I knew this was no ordinary warning. This was a call to wake up, to see the truth before it was too late. Jesus gestured toward the screens, and I couldn't hold back my question. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his expression so serious it made my heart stop. "It is not yet the mark of the beast," he said, "but it is conditioning them to accept it. The enemy is preparing their hearts to worship him instead of me." They are being trained to value convenience, approval, and instant gratification above all else. When the time comes, they will accept the mark without hesitation. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words hit me hard. I thought about the countless hours I had spent staring at my phone, scrolling through apps, feeling consumed by what I saw. I thought about the times I had felt worthless because of comparisons to people online or the things I didn't have. I remembered the arguments with my parents when they told me to put my phone down. I always thought they were exaggerating, that they didn't understand. Now I wasn't so sure. The scene around us began to change. I found myself standing in what looked like a massive war zone, but this wasn't a battlefield with guns, tanks, or soldiers. It was something far more unsettling. Families, parents, grandparents, children, teens stood on one side of the field, but they weren't fighting together. Instead, they were fighting each other. The older generations yelled at the younger ones, accusing them of being lazy, selfish, and addicted. They blamed them for being glued to their phones and for not valuing the things they had worked hard to provide. On the other side, younger generations yelled back, saying their parents didn't understand the pressures they faced. They blamed the older generations for creating the very problems they were now struggling to deal with: economic instability, societal expectations, and the overwhelming presence of technology. In the midst of this chaos, I noticed the enemy standing in the shadows, laughing. He wasn't part of the battle, he was the cause of it. He was planting seeds of division and watching them grow. He didn't need to fight because the families were destroying themselves. They are supposed to be united, Jesus said, his voice filled with sadness. But the enemy has turned them against each other. The older generations must wake up and see that their children and grandchildren are under attack. They must fight for them, not against them. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all. How? I asked desperately. What can they do? They must pray, Jesus said firmly. They must teach my word. They must set an example by putting me above all else, even their own distractions. Many of them have been lulled to sleep by the same devices. His words sank deep into my heart. The older generations were not just onlookers. They had a role, a responsibility to guide and protect. Yet they too were trapped by the same distractions, the same chains. The only way forward was through prayer, teaching, and leading by example. Jesus gestured toward the screens, and as I looked closer, I saw something that filled me with sadness. Older people were glued to their phones too. Some were scrolling through news, while others were playing games, completely absorbed. Meanwhile, their children wandered aimlessly into the darkness, unnoticed. It wasn't just the younger generations falling into these traps. It was everyone. Then the scene shifted, and what I saw next broke my heart. I found myself in the middle of a church service, but it wasn't like any church I had ever known. The sanctuary was full of people, but almost no one seemed to be paying attention. Worship was happening, but instead of lifting their hearts to God, many were scrolling through their phones, barely noticing the songs. Some were even taking selfies, capturing pictures to post later, instead of focusing on the presence of God. As I looked toward the pulpit, I saw the pastor preaching passionately. His words were full of truth and urgency, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. People sat in the pews, but their minds were somewhere else. The glow of screens lit up the room, creating an artificial light that seemed to drown out the holy presence that should have been there. The spiritual focus of the place was lost, replaced by distractions. "This is my house," Jesus said, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "But it has become a marketplace for distractions. My people no longer seek me with their whole hearts. They seek entertainment, validation, and convenience. They have traded my presence for temporary pleasures. The pain in his voice hit me like a weight. I wanted to scream, to cry, to shake everyone awake and make them see what they were doing. But I couldn't. I felt powerless in the face of what I was witnessing. Instead, I turned to Jesus, desperate for answers. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I'm just a kid." Jesus placed his hand gently on my shoulder, and his eyes met mine. His gaze was full of love, but also firm and steady. "You are more than you think you are," he said. "You are my messenger. I have chosen you to warn them, not just your generation, but all generations." His words filled me with both purpose and fear. "But they won't listen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "They'll think I'm crazy. No one will believe me." Jesus nodded, and his voice softened, but his message was clear. "They rejected me too," he said, "but some will hear, and their eyes will be opened. Speak boldly. Tell them what you have seen. Warn them that the time is short." In that moment, I felt the full weight of his words settle deeply on my heart. It wasn't just a request, it was a calling. I didn't know how I would do it or where to even begin, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. The urgency of his words was undeniable, and I stood there overwhelmed by what I had seen and the responsibility placed on me. I wanted to question why he had chosen me, someone so young and unsure, but deep down I knew this wasn't about me. It was about his message. It wasn't my strength or wisdom that mattered. It was his truth and the power behind it. As I looked back at the church, the people and the screens, I realized how much was at stake. It wasn't just about distractions or technology, it was about hearts, souls, and eternal choices. The world was slipping further away from God, and the enemy was using every tool he could to pull people deeper into darkness. I didn't know how I would get people to listen. I didn't know what I would say. But I knew I had to try. I couldn't turn away from what I had seen. Even if only a few listened, even if it felt impossible, I had to speak. Jesus had chosen me for this, and I couldn't let fear stop me. In that moment, I silently prayed for courage. I prayed that his message would reach those who needed to hear it. I prayed that he would guide me and give me the strength to be his messenger. No matter how hard it would be, I knew I couldn't stay silent. The time was short and the warning had to be shared. In an instant, I found myself back in my living room. My heart was racing, pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Tears were streaming down my face, and I could feel every single one. My phone was still in my hand, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt cold, heavy, almost like it carried a dark weight. I didn't want it near me. Without thinking, I threw it across the room, watching as it landed far away from me. Then I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by everything I had just experienced, and began crying out to God with all my heart. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing and my spirit felt restless. Instead of trying to force myself to rest, I did something I had never done with such urgency. I prayed. I prayed harder and longer than I ever had before. I prayed for my friends that they would see the truth. I prayed for my family that they would be protected and guided. I prayed for my generation caught in a battle they didn't even know they were fighting. I even prayed for older generations that they would wake up and help guide us back to what truly matters. My heart poured out everything to God, and I begged him to give me the courage and strength to share what I had seen. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. If you're reading this, I believe it's not by chance. I believe Jesus wants you to hear this warning. This isn't just about kids and their phones or about one generation being more affected than another. It's about all of us. The enemy is using technology to distract us, divide us, and ultimately destroy us. He is setting the stage, preparing hearts and minds to accept what is coming. If we don't wake up now, if we don't see what's happening, it might be too late. To parents, grandparents, and older friends, you have a role in this fight. Don't sit back and watch. Pray for your children and grandchildren. Talk to them about these dangers. Don't ignore the warning signs or dismiss these problems as just a phase. Set an example by putting down your own devices, by showing them what it means to put God first in your life. Let them see you seeking Him above everything else. And to my generation, don't let the enemy steal your soul through a screen. Don't let the temporary satisfaction of likes, comments, or followers define your worth. Seek Jesus. Open His word and find your value in Him. He is the only one who can give you what you are searching for. The time is short. We don't have forever to make these choices. The decision is in your hands. Will you let the enemy win, or will you seek the truth and freedom that only Jesus can give? The choice is yours. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith